Hey, everybody. Welcome to the very first edition of This Moment We're In, the show that explores how teams are navigating AI-driven change in real time, from messy experiments and breakthrough solutions to thought-provoking ideas about how roles, collaboration, and talent are being reimagined. I'm Cindy Chastain, and today I'm talking with Brandt Flomer, the founder of Beacon Advisory, a consultancy helping companies apply technology and customer centricity to innovate and grow. I hope you enjoy the show. Good morning, Brent. Great to see you.
Hi, Cindy. Great to be here with you.
You know, I am so honored to have you as the first guest on my show. We've known each other for a while, so I've really come to appreciate the level of thoughtfulness and ingenuity you bring to the work you do.
Oh, thanks, Cindy. That's really kind. It's great to be here with you, and we have indeed known each other for quite a while. I attribute any of that ingenuity to the fact that I've been fortunate to work with great people like yourself at some pretty special companies in informative moments. So fantastic to be here. Thanks for having me as your guest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I knew you had to be that guest because of a absolutely brilliant article that you wrote called Craft is Your Only Moat in the Age of AI. Now, Brent, I will be honest, this is the first time I've seen such a clear point of view around how AI has the potential for not just eroding judgment, but for sidestepping the very feedback loops that help people learn taste and judgment in the first place. And the best part, you gave us a framework and a set of principles for how craft and AI fueled velocity can work together. So, in fact, if every business applied your framework that you're going to introduce in this show today, I think they could potentially 100x the value of AI tools being used at their company.
Wow. That's your value. That's quite a claim, but very much in keeping with the current AI hype cycle. So let's roll with it, and we'll see if we can make that happen.
And that we will do. You know, I'm not a hypester, but what you wrote got me so excited. So before we dig in, can you help our listeners understand the main idea of your piece and what led you to it?
Sure. I think fundamentally, AI has the potential to be an amazing tool for increasing the speed and scale of what individuals, teams, and organizations can actually achieve. But it's only valuable when our taste and our judgment actually point it somewhere worth going, at something worth doing. And so my argument, the observation I make in the article that you mentioned, is that it's through a renewed focus on craft and the disciplined application of these amazing technologies, those things will be key to successfully harnessing the power of AI. It came from my experience working with my clients over the past couple years as they have eagerly tried to embrace and adopt and integrate generative AI into their work. Like a lot of companies, my clients are often somewhere on a spectrum between those who are encouraging their employees to use AI to improve their efficiency. And then there's some who are more dramatically rethinking how they operate, how they compete, what work looks like for them. So those companies are trying to build new ways of working with AI kind of at the core, stripping everything down, rebuilding it. In some cases, those companies might be starting something new, right, with kind of AI at the core, more AI native or AI first.
There really is a spectrum of the ways in which companies are starting to integrate these tools in their workflows.
Yeah, I think that that's true. But wherever they fall on that spectrum, you kind of whatever their level of ambition, their appetite for disrupting how they're working and integrating AI. I noticed some recurring themes in conversations with leaders. You know, a lot of them, have real concerns that the workflows that they're enabling with AI and integrating these tools and technologies into are ultimately producing some fairly derivative, undifferentiated end product that just doesn't meet their bar for quality. Some others, observing that their teams are shipping faster, shipping more, but unfortunately thinking less. So what that's leading to the need for a lot more interventions and rework. And that is often resulting not in greater efficiency and productivity, which is kind of the promise and the hope. And that often hits those leaders and their more senior people in the organization, right? In terms of where that impact is coming, in terms of actually disrupting productivity, not increasing or enhancing productivity. And then there's kind of another bucket of people who are actually having some limited success with pilots where they're devoting a lot of personal bandwidth and energy. But it feels like it's going to be something that's difficult to replicate at scale. So that they're, asking questions that are a little bit different about how do we achieve these results. So the article that I
Mhm.
wrote was an attempt to kind of make sense of those challenges and suggest a path forward that I see.
I find that second point especially interesting because if you think about someone is using a tool who is out of their depth when it comes to doing certain kinds of work, you end up wasting more time with rework. And I wonder how much companies are even seeing that. But that really puts the RO Gen AI in question.
Yeah, I think unfortunately that is not an outlier. There's a study towards the end of last year from MIT that got a lot of attention because it concluded that an eye-catching 95% of generative AI pilots at companies were not seeing any measurable return on their investment in those technologies. Now, there's a variety of reasons why that's happening, probably including an underinvestment in capability building and change management, the maturity of data architecture and the underlying infrastructure in some of those organizations. But my article focused on one which I feel is maybe underrepresented in some of the reaction and the discourse and the dialogue that studies like that have generated and companies, real world experience. And that is the importance of craft.
Yeah. Which I love. And it's funny because a lot of people have been talking about craft this year or last year, 2025, even outside of Gen AI. For example,
Mm.
what does it even mean? How do you hire for craft? How do you lead craft, et cetera? So, from your perspective, what do you mean by craft?
Sure. Probably important because when I wrote and published that article, I had one former colleague, reach out to me and say, "Hey, I saw this," and they had a lot of positive things to say about it. But they said, initially that word "craft" it was off-putting to me, and I almost didn't read further than that. And I think that
No.
reaction, might be somewhat more widespread because there can be an association of craft as being something that is about a group of people worrying about their special thing, the special thing that they do, the way that they do it, and that's at threat in some way. Right?
Totally.
It can feel a little insular. It can feel a little clicky. This is the sacred thing that we're trying to protect. So that was not my intent at all. I actually see craft as something much broader and more general. So in my article, I define it as the disciplined application of judgment to produce
Mhm.
work that meets a meaningful standard. So, craft requires
Love it.
knowing what good looks like. It requires understanding your tools deeply enough to use them judiciously and also importantly, having the conviction to say, not yet, when something doesn't meet your standards. So, all of those things I think apply as much to strategy consulting or software engineering or accounting as much as it does to things that we might associate with craft, that are more artisanal or design oriented, whether that's furniture making or product design, right? So, I see it as something that has broad relevance applied to a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different industries.
Yeah. Yeah. I really, really like how you're framing this because my observation has been that many think of craft in a very, very narrow sense. To add to your examples, strong design craft being associated with the look and feel of an artifact. But if you're talking about craft as judgment or how one gets to something of quality based on that judgment, it's applicable to any field. And I love that you say that. So tell me a little bit more about your observations.
Yeah, well, again, I think based on the things that I've been observing that a lot of organizations and teams are failing to harness this amazing potential of generative AI because they're not paying sufficient attention to how they apply and, yes, evolve their craft to make appropriate use of these incredibly powerful capabilities. And I emphasize appropriate use because I think large language models have several attributes or characteristics that, if they're left unchecked, they can actually breed lazy thinking and bad habits, which are really the antithesis of craft. With minimal effort, they generate output that looks plausible and professional. These might be rough
Mhm.
ideas, but they're kind of masquerading as something that is more finished, more complete, more thought through than they actually are. Another thing, as a default setting, these LLMs, they flatter, they don't critique, they don't provide pointed feedback. So those things, they give the illusion of progress. They actually induce us to cede our judgment and our taste and to be less critical in our thinking. So my belief is that those organizations that are will succeed are those who can actually offset that and can more rigorously and systematically apply their judgment and apply their standards. Ultimately, these are the
Mhm.
things that only humans can supply, but that also has to be done while we harness the speed, the scale, and leverage of AI. So that means we have to evolve our craft, right? We have to hold on to some things that are timeless and true. And we also have to be
Mhm.
open to thinking about how we evolve, how we apply these tools and technologies, and how we practice our craft.
You know, what's interesting is doing that takes time. It's almost as if you're redesigning workflows, et cetera. So while trying to figure these out, and I've spoken to a lot of leaders out there, particularly in design, who are really struggling with team bandwidth and really being intentional and taking the time to not only run experiments, but potentially document them. And so that in and of itself, while you're learning, starts to slow things down. So it's a huge challenge. But in your article, you had some really interesting real world examples that you encountered. Could you share one of those stories and how it played out?
Sure. I think, in my consulting work over the past year or so, I've been engaged by several clients who had stumbled with their initial efforts at AI powered transformation. And they were seeking some help to rethink their approach and get those initiatives back on track. So, in the article, I share a story kind of derived from that experience about meeting with a product team who had been charged with creating a dashboard that would allow my client to monitor their KPIs for one of those strategic initiatives. Now, the product manager had DM'd or Slacked the designer on her team, and we need a dashboard for these customer health metrics that's going to flag the at-risk accounts. These are the metrics. These are the conditions that should trigger a flag. Mock something up. Let's get
I
going.
I feel like I've experienced this at some
You've seen
in
that
my career
message, right?
early on. I didn't send a message, but I think I've received that message at
Yeah.
some point in my life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally reasonable. On the receiving end, the designer was eager to move fast and show off what they'd actually just learned to do with the latest release of their company approved LLM. They got the message that this is the future. They'd got the message that we should be looking for ways to integrate these tools, these technologies into work, and they'd taken that to heart, right? So what did they do? They sketched an interface on paper. They snapped a photo. They asked that AI model to build it. And a few minutes later, right, they had a working prototype with charts, with color coded indicators, clear typography, right? So they didn't have to produce mock-ups themselves. They didn't have to produce handoff documentation for the development team. Just a brief Slack conversation with the PM, their sketch, and then right, so their company approved LLM. So amazing, magical, exactly what we're supposed to be doing, right? The dashboard prototype looked kind of plausible. It looked professional. It had a certain degree of completeness to it. So the team was eager to share it back with stakeholders to show their progress and get their reaction. But if you step back from it, it wasn't actually clear if it was solving the right problem. I'd been working with the client on that strategic initiative, helped them define what those KPIs should be and why those were significant and what they were representative of. And so when I asked the product manager and the designer, you know, well, what decision will this dashboard help someone make? And who is that someone specifically, right? Is it the account rep? Is it the account rep's manager? They kind of paused and they looked and they kind of looked at each other. And so well, okay. So, and what's the behavior change that you need? And how are people using this? What constraints matter? The answer to these questions weren't clear to that team, and their briefing hadn't specified. And normally they would stop and ask those clarifying questions. But in their eagerness to leverage these amazing new tools, right, they jumped right in. So we spent 30 minutes kind of testing some of the hypotheses that we came up with and clarifying that intent with a few stakeholders. And then the designer prompted again. Same tooling, same speed, but the output that was generated quite different based on that moment to kind of pause and reflect and clarify, the answer to some of those important questions.
It's almost as if the allure or excitement around the tools themselves caused a bit of amnesia. You might have forgot that
Yeah.
maybe we should be starting with something different. So when you think about that in other circumstances, what's the key learning? What do you feel people need to do differently?
Well, I think you actually touched on something interesting where this actually is a little bit of a condition. It is not amnesia, but there's actually a term which I learned as I was sort of like writing the article called cognitive offloading, which is the fact that we do tend to suspend judgment, right? We delegate critical thinking. And so those things kind of erode. And I think, a large number of people listening to this podcast, working in these environments over the past year or two have probably experienced this firsthand, right? The teams that they're a part of that work for them are shipping faster, but it seems are thinking less, right? In the story that
Mhm.
I told, this wasn't a junior inexperienced team. When pushed, they knew they should have a perspective on those questions, and they were able to shape that perspective for testing and validation. But these technologies are incredibly seductive, right? They give us the power to conjure from thin air, right? They're more and more capable with each passing month. And the kind of effort and knowledge required to use them, to apply them, are so minimal that they can be used to generate this content that, right, is kind of like masquerading as finished work. So this phenomenon is so widespread that it's been given a name, work slop. I think it might have even made its way into contention for the word of the year by Merriam-Webster. Um,
I think it did. Yeah.
but it's a winner of a name. It's a cool name, but not so great in the workplace, right? There is this deluge of AI generated output that often requires rework. And again, there's been enough of this going on that there are now studies about this, right? A study out of Stanford concluded that this every instance of work slop requires about 2 hours per incident to remedy or rectify. And that comes at a cost equivalent to $9 million a year in a 10,000 person, company. So this is pretty significant.
Mind blowing. I don't think I've seen those statistics. Uh, so what are the implications here?
Well, I think organizations are learning the hard way through some of these early initiatives, right? That getting to greater speed, increasing your throughput without being able to apply taste and judgment and discernment, right? That's not productivity. It's actually
Mhm.
capability decay at scale, right? You're kind of eroding and undermining what you're trying to achieve ultimately.
Okay, I just have to say that myself because it is so spot on and probably hidden from all this from most people's perspective. But capability decay at scale? that could have massive implications for any organization. I mean, it's almost like the reverse of the outcomes people hope for with AI.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those classic "be careful what you wish for," right? And some of
Yeah.
the assumptions people have going in about what's possible. Again, in theory, in the lab, right? In terms of what the capabilities that are being created and what they can do, right? The potential is clearly there. The question is, how do we harness it, and why is this happening in a real world environment, right? In a company, in an enterprise setting, right? It's happening at an individual level. Then you amplify that to the team level, you amplify that to the organization level, right? The kind of the risk, the cost, the unrealized potential is pretty significant.
Hmm. Well, from your observations, what do you think is really happening? How would you sum it up?
Well, there's a few things going on. I think starting with often we are sending the wrong signals, about what are we trying to do here. Saying we're rewiring our work with AI so that we can get to market faster with highly personalized solutions tailored to the needs and preferences of our customers is a very different message than, hey, team, we have an opportunity to be much more efficient. You can use AI to do the work of 10 people. That's our target, right? Um,
Hmm.
you're sending a signal there about what you're trying to do in terms of the ultimate outcome, the ultimate objective, and that can sort of set people off in the wrong trajectory in some cases. I think another thing
Makes
is
sense.
um, we are undermining how people learn if we're not careful. When we use generative AI, we can go from a prompt to a fully formed output without any iteration and dialogue except that I'm having with Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT or whichever LLM that I'm using. The thinking process and the decision making is pretty opaque or invisible, right? It's contained only in that chat thread you have with that tool. But it's in that dialogue with colleagues that we develop insight. It's in that dialogue that we learn taste and that we build good judgment, especially when that dialogue is with those who are more experienced in their craft, more experienced in the
Hmm.
domain that we're working in, right? That dialogue is really the cornerstone of apprenticeship and how craft is developed. But in a lot of organizations, that model, that apprenticeship model, broke with the pandemic and the
Oh
proliferation of
yeah.
hybrid and remote working models. But generative AI arrived kind of right after that, before we had a chance to rebuild it and figure out, well, what does apprenticeship look like in this new working model, right?
Yeah. And they're doing much of the time that work in isolation, right? It's so interesting that you kind of put those two things together in terms of the conditions that have changed since the pandemic. But here's the big question. When you start to recognize, okay, this is the risk, or this is what could potentially be happening in your organization if you're not already attuned to it. So, how does a leader or someone listening to this podcast change that? What can be done?
Well, I think being intentional about how you introduce healthy friction that sharpens
Mm.
the thinking and sharpens the work, right? When coaching teams and especially managers or leaders, I often draw a simple 2x2 to illustrate an incredibly important lesson that I've learned about how you achieve breakthroughs and get to truly distinctive and differentiated solutions, right? And that 2x2, on one axis, you have sort of simple and complex. And on the other one, you have expected and elegant, right? You often in your problem solving in your work in whatever that work, whatever field or industry, you kind of start at simple and expected, and you go about trying to figure out what the answer is, and you inevitably end up somewhere that is either simple and complex or elegant but still complex. And that journey, that phase is often referred to as the messy middle. Many solutions get stuck or lost there, right? Whether it's a new product, whether it's the next report for the board, whether it's the next report for investors, um, we get stuck or lost along the way, right? The hard work, that last mile, requires you to rigorously edit and pare that down to a solution that is both simple and elegant. But if we don't create the time and the moments to refine and hone, we're in trouble. And generative AI kind of accelerates to the midpoint.
Here's another thought. If we're losing craft, we still have to go through that messy middle. The outputs also will only be as good as the craft or the level of knowledge and judgment that a person can bring to that. So the output is only as good as the judgment, ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, as we were talking about before, regardless of your vocation or craft or discipline, right, we need to critique. We need to grapple and mold and edit and hone, right, to have any hope of getting to a solution that's both elegant and simple. Now,
Mhm.
experts and masters in their craft have developed intuition and pattern recognition to be able to highlight opportunities for improvement and shortcut or accelerate that problem solving, right? To get to something truly great and distinctive. But that requires that dialogue, right? It requires creating moments of critique to unpack and expose what was the thinking, what were the calls that you made to get here. So
Mhm.
if we're only sort of like relying on what comes out the other end after working with generative AI, right? It shortcuts and shortchanges all of that. So we have to treat the outputs created by AI as inputs to that process, not as the solution itself.
I love that. The outputs created by AI are the inputs into the process that you're using AI for, not as a solution itself. So this didn't come up in your article, but I think a lot around how there is this broad assumption and excitement around the fact that people who are in certain disciplines are able to do things outside of their discipline because of the tools. Now, personally, I think that's great. I think it's great that a product manager can go create a prototype, but there is still perhaps an imbalance of craft in those situations, right? A designer can do vibe coding, an engineer can do design. So I find that all very, very interesting when you think about how it plays against craft. I don't know if you have any instinctual thoughts before we go on. It's just something that came to mind.
Yeah, well, I think it just highlights that kind of cross disciplinary dialogue and interaction is often really important. Like, yes, you can be an army of one and you can use these tools to generate output that is pretty good, seemingly plausible, but to get to great, right, it requires more dialogue, more critique, and it does require expertise potentially beyond what you have as an individual. And you only get there right through the kind of process that we've been talking about and through the application of different perspectives and that kind of dialogue and critique that happens in a team. And so
Hmm.
I think if thinking of the role that you play as a leader, right? It's really important to make sure that you're creating those moments. You're creating the space for that. You're making clear that there's an expectation that that's part of the process and that the inputs are just feeding into that process.
Right. So collaboration, active dialogue across disciplines becomes essentially even more important.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's
Yeah.
some, kind of timeless fundamentals that aren't obviated just because we can get to something that seems pretty good very quickly.
Yeah. So thinking again around craft, this is a really tough thing to manage. But what can teams do to not only avoid Okay, we've talked about dialogue, et cetera, but the foundational sort of building of craft versus the backward erosion, right? How do you maintain the conditions in which craft is built? Because that, I believe, and I think that's what you're saying, is so foundational to doing good work.
Yeah. I mean, I think another one that we've just been talking about is we can't assume that taste develops via kind of osmosis and exposure anymore. You need to be intentional about creating moments where judgment is visible and teachable. And often that means slowing down the decision making process, even as execution speeds up. It means being explicit about what good looks like, especially when you reject the output as not good enough. Like, where is the bar? How do you define that? So that, there's a range of things that as leaders, right, making sure that our judgment is kind of visible and teachable, that we can do and
Mhm.
invest in.
Yeah, we got to slow down, if you will, in order to speed up sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the original AI guy, Abraham Lincoln, was famously, when he was asked, how should I use Claude? He said, well, if I had 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first two sharpening my axe.
There you go. So aptly applied. I love it. Thank you. So the last thing I really want to talk to you about. So in your article, um, you started to sort of break this down. Here's a problem that things you've observed, how a team, a leader might start to address it. But you brought us a beautiful framework. And as I like to say, anything worth repeating often requires a framework to shift mindsets, behaviors, and to really deliver at scale. So, can you talk a little bit about that framework? It's another thing that got me really excited about your
Sure.
article.
Well, I couldn't claim to be, a consultant if I didn't bring a framework. So,
Of course.
it's kind of a mental model and a framework that I introduced in the article, in talking about the interplay between craft and AI and how to get to really great outcomes. Is compass times flywheel equals impact. Your compass is your intent, your taste, your judgment, right? It's knowing what good looks like and where you're trying to go. Now, your flywheel is the speed and scale that AI enables. Together, they produce reliable quality and repeatable results, right? That's how you get to meaningful impact. Now, if your compass isn't pointed in the right direction, AI just helps you go faster in the wrong direction. Now, equally, a finely calibrated compass without that flywheel is equally limiting. You're not able to execute at the speed and scale necessary to compete. Um, so, your job as a leader isn't to slow down the flywheel or resist AI adoption. It's to ensure that the compass stays true while the flywheel accelerates, right? You've got to have both of those things working together in tandem.
Love this framework because you're really showing how you could maximize the value, game craft, as well as speed efficiency at scale. So, can you give us the real world example around how this framework was applied?
Sure. Let me try to make it more tangible with an example. So if we go back to the product team that we were talking about before, let's imagine this time they were tasked with improving the onboarding flow for their signature product, right? We think
Mhm.
of the compass. To ensure that their compass is calibrated, they might start by writing a 2 sentence statement of intent, right? A short list of non-negotiables. The onboarding flow should reduce time to first value. It should de-risk unfamiliar steps visually. It should make recovery obvious, right? These are kind of articulating your non-negotiable design principles. If we do nothing
Mhm.
else, right, the solution has to have these qualities or these characteristics. And all these things together help clarify what they're trying to achieve and what good looks like. provides the necessary context to give inputs then to their AI tooling. Um, it also helps ensure that you're aligned with stakeholders and everyone has the same set of assumptions and expectations about what are we trying to do here and what good looks like. So that's the kind of the compass
Mm.
side of that equation. So compass times flywheel. So they can also get their flywheel cranking to accelerate execution, right? They can use their LLM to consolidate interview notes from their product discovery, their research. What are the pain patterns? How do we articulate opportunity statements? They might prompt for 10 variations of that onboarding flow, each with a kind of a rationale, and they could simulate what are the drop off hotspots, right? Where would a confused user fail? They can have AI evaluate those flows for clarity, accessibility, consistency with brand standards, whatever kind of input we want to give and guidance and direction, they can then start to see, well, what elements from those 10 variations do we want to make part of the proposed solution? Again, these are just inputs to the process and the team applying their taste, their judgment, their discernment. So those two things together, what once took them 4 or 5 weeks to get
Mhm.
to a solution, to get that solution sort of socialized, they might now be able to do that in 1 week. They have several polished options to choose from, and that product team spent their time and energy on the things that only humans can do, right? Defining intent, making judgment calls about trade offs between potential solutions, and framing up a persuasive narrative for their stakeholders about here's the recommended path forward. So the compass and the flywheel work in concert to kind of accelerate and amplify impact that team is able to achieve. So if you do those things together across your organization consistently, right, that's how you're going to get to the outsized impact and harness the potential that AI offers and avoid falling into the trap of just generating work slop.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for that very tangible example. I hope that was useful to people listening. The thing that I was also fascinated about was this idea that you talk about patterns, reusable components. It's almost as if one could create or a team could create an AI pattern library that becomes a way to scale as well. Sounds like that's what you're saying, which is
Yeah,
super
absolutely.
interesting idea.
I actually wrote a follow-up article exploring exactly that and providing some kind of tips and pointers on what that looks like, how to do that. Because I think that is a key way of how you apply your taste and judgment at scale, right? You can make those things basically knowable, readable to AI so that it can interpret and apply that, and by doing that, that's really the magic, right, of being able to bring the compass
Mhm.
and the flywheel together to really achieve outsized impact.
Well, for those of you listening, we will be sure to put a link to that other article, both articles, in fact, in the show notes. So let's bring this home for leaders who are hopefully liking the perspective that you're sharing, um, and are also grappling with these challenges day to day. The people who are leading teams, maybe the people who are not necessarily in the weeds of experimentation, but are hoping to steer this moment of discovery in the right direction. What advice would you give them?
Hmm. Well, I'd highlight a few things that probably deserve extra attention right now in the moment that we're in, because it is early. We've been talking about some high level observations. We've been talking about some things that are being reinforced with studies now that we have a year or two of experience under our belt with what this is looking like out in the real world. Everyone's trying different tools, different approaches without a whole lot of coordination. So that creates learning, but also a lot of duplication and wasted efforts. So how do leaders need to strike a delicate balance between encouraging exploration while creating mechanisms to capture and share what's actually working? Can we create safe spaces to fail without career
Mhm.
consequences? Or can we build channels and forums for people to share both their wins and their failures and celebrate both? Can we resist the urge to standardize too early before those patterns emerge? Um, and as with most things in company life, right, that won't take root unless leaders themselves set a positive example. They have to set the tone. They have to encourage. They have to model themselves, right? That kind of lowers the implied risk for everybody else in the company.
Speaking of setting the right tone and being a model, to what degree do you think leaders, we'll talk about directors, could be VPs, could be above. What is your point of view on the degree to which those leaders should also be experimenting and learning the tools so that they have greater, perhaps, empathy and understanding themselves? Maybe not going as deep, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think the organizations I've seen have the most success have people, up to the CEO level who've been pretty vocal about not just saying this is what we want to accomplish, but rolling up their sleeves and demonstrating that
Mhm.
commitment, right, through their own effort, where they're spending their time, right? So I think requires building just a certain amount of literacy to understand the technologies and what they are and what they're capable of, and also recognizing that that's evolving very quickly. So it's not a one and done, right? It's a commitment that you have to sustain
Yeah,
to
yeah.
staying abreast and having that familiarity, right? You don't have to be a deep expert at that level, but you do have to have some degree of familiarity or literacy and understanding about what they are.
Yep, I wholeheartedly agree. So I'm glad you got to share your thoughts on that one. Brad, this has like been such a fun conversation. I'm just so happy for what you were able to share with us today. But I'd like to end with, some of the key takeaways for our audience. I think there's a lot we could go over here. But, one of the things that stuck out to me is that your job as a leader, ultimately, and kind of following up what you were saying, isn't to resist AI or to slow teams down, is to ensure that when they accelerate, they're aimed at something that matters. The huge takeaway, right? And sometimes that is the leader's job to point in that direction or to provide the right aim. The other thing, this idea that organizations and teams that succeed won't be the ones with the most AI adoption, but they'll be the ones whose people can still tell good from bad, important from urgent, signals from love, should I say, right? It's that piece. Um, those are the things that really, really struck me. What else would you add?
I think those are really critical. Like ultimately, this is a period of transition. It's a period
Mhm.
of great possibility and great potential, of heightened expectations. And it's happening at a time where there's also a lot of cost pressures and a lot of things going on there. So there's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of anxiety. So as a leader, right, we have to help people make sense of that. Um, and one way we can do that, as we talked about, is by making sure we're being very deliberate and intentional about the signals that we're sending, about what are we trying to do as we pick up these tools, right? What's it in service of? It's being intentional and recognizing that the tools themselves lead to certain behaviors unchecked, right? So how do I offset that in a healthy way and introduce friction that is healthy and see that as healthy and not just slowing down things. And by providing, kind of clarity about what we're trying to do, creating the moments for dialogue and learning, and really leaning into that kind of experimentation that we talked about and doing that firsthand. These are all critical things that can help us navigate this.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this discussion, Brent.
Thanks, sending me too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. But before I let you go, ask what are you most hopeful about in this moment we're in?
Ah, um, yeah, well, I think there's amazing potential, right? And we've talked about some of the pitfalls and some of people's early experience. Um, but ultimately, in kind of writing the article and reflecting more on this, it reinforced for me that as we figure out how to integrate AI into our work and make the most effective use of these capabilities, it really puts a premium on what remains uniquely our contribution to make. Some of those timeless fundamentals in terms of critical thinking, creative problem solving, they get renewed focus and attention, right? That includes things like framing, right? It includes things like interpretation. It includes things like facilitation, right? How do I guide groups through the ambiguity and the conflict or the uncertainty? AI can't do those things. And I'm not always great at them either, but knowing that's how I'll make a difference. And that's the unique value that I'll bring into the workplace as I collaborate and work with AI. It's forcing me to sharpen those skills and build those aptitudes and be more reflective. Ultimately, I'm hopeful that AI will make us individually and our workplaces more humane by putting a premium on those things and causing that reflection.
Yeah. Nice note to end on. Brant, thank you so much
Thanks, Cindy.
for being here and being the guinea pig as my first guest on this podcast. So thank you for that as well.
My pleasure. Thanks for
Interesting.
making it a safe space for that experimentation.
Before we close, I want to sit with another thing Brant said, because it captures what's really at stake in this moment. We're not just adopting new tools, we're quietly reshaping how people learn, how judgment is formed, and how standards are passed from one generation to the next. Speed is seductive, for sure, but capability, decay, has the potential for reducing a company's competitive edge. Without craft, without judgment, from the people using the tools, AI can't possibly deliver on its potential. You need the flywheel, but you also need the compass, as Brant said. So I hope you enjoyed this. This has been this moment we're in. Thanks so much for listening.